You've likely heard the stories. 400 years ago, intrepid European settlers sailed here to the New World to break free from religious tyranny and begin new lives. They tamed a pristine wilderness, barely touched by its few inhabitants, those they called Indians. Small, nomadic hunter-gatherer bands who lived in harmony with nature and left it unspoiled. These rugged settlers improved the land, bringing livestock, crops, and ideas on farming over from Europe, clearing the landscape and lining their pastures with hundreds of thousands of miles of stone walls. Some Indians assimilated, but most left. Their way of life incompatible with the new residents, they went out west. That's the story, the Yankee Lore. But it's not exactly true. Sometimes exploring our ancient stone mysteries of New England means relearning a little history. I'm author and researcher Mike Luoma. And sometimes when discussing the possibility some of our old New England stonework could be ancient indigenous work, someone will stop me to say, that's not possible. Indians around here didn't build with stone. It's a widely held assumption. Local folklore. Yankee Lore. Something everybody in New England just knows to be true. Except that it's not. Indians began building with stone around here over 4,000 years ago. The oldest documented stone-built structure ever found in Massachusetts was a 4,000-year-old indigenous-built stone wall, discovered as part of an ancient rock shelter, and blown up to make way for a highway access road in 1980. You might not have heard much about this. Not much was made of the discovery at the time. In fact, the first public reports didn't appear until decades later. A summary report finally came out in the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society in 2006, 26 years after the fact. A report for the general public wasn't released until 2011, over 3 decades later. What took them so long? Did they not want to publicize the fact Indians around here, quote-unquote, actually did build with stone? Were they trying to avoid challenging Yankee Lore? Yankee Lore creates a kind of cultural inertia. When everybody in New England just knows something to be true, it becomes difficult to change that impression. Even archaeologists don't seem to be immune. Until recently, if you grew up in New England, you were steeped in Yankee lore, in school, local culture, and society in general. This is stuff you just know. It can be jarring to discover some of these stories, like the ones told at the start of this presentation, aren't really true. Much Yankee lore grew up in spite of history, not in support of it. These are stories we told ourselves about ourselves and our past to make us feel better about ourselves and our outcomes. Yankee ingenuity gets read back into and through a version of the past where our current reality is seen as the inevitable outcome of providential progress, created by ingenious Yankee settlers. And so Jamestown and the commercial conquests of Virginia, Spanish invasions and takeovers to the south and west, even the fact Pilgrims were only half the people on the Mayflower, All of these are downplayed, and fleeing tyranny, religious and otherwise, over-exaggerated. Truth is, most Europeans came to this continent to harvest resources and make money, to claim land when there was no land for them back in Europe. When some of these aspects were brought out, with the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth, they were met with public backlash. Thanks to the power of Yankee Lore. Challenging it can sometimes be seen as cultural heresy. The idea of the pristine wilderness is a good example of the power of Yankee Lore. That's why it's included as part of the opening stories. Turns out to be completely false. There was no pristine wilderness. That's Yankee Lore that grew up when the once curated forests and gardens of the Northeast began to grow wild with the demise and departure of their indigenous tenders. If you grew up hearing about the Great Forest Primeval, it can be jarring to read scholar William Cronin's revelation. This was not a wilderness which had existed for eons, uninfluenced by human hands. In his 1983 book, Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England. Instead, nothing could be further from the truth, he tells us. 20 years later, in his 2005 bestseller 1491, Charles C. Mann observed that indigenous people were a keystone species in the ecology, annually burning undergrowth, clearing and replanting forests, building canals and raising fields, hunting bison and netting salmon, growing maize and the Eastern Agricultural Complex. Native Americans had been managing their environment for thousands of years, but all these efforts required close, continual oversight. Their loss resulted in a significant shift in the composition of the ecological community. In his 2012 history, The First Frontier, Scott Wiedensahl notes that the land of the first frontier co-evolved with humans and their ready ally, the flame. If there ever was a balance of nature in the East, it was a case of natural systems finding some measure of equilibrium amid the pressures of hunting, agriculture, and fire as practiced by more than 1 million hungry, busy human beings. There were a lot more people here than Yankee Lore admits. Wiedensahl writes, recent estimates put the pre-colonial population at 3.8 million people, with as many as 1 million of them living between the Appalachians and the Atlantic. Some scholars put the population at almost twice that. So, lots of people here. No pristine wilderness. That whole idea actually came later. The first explorers here described delightfully open park-like woods free of undergrowth, intermixed with wide grasslands and savannas. A mosaic of habitats it now seems clear were created and maintained with fire. Wiedensahl cites Giovanni de Verrazzano in 1524, the Reverend John Bremerton on Martha's Vineyard in 1602, William Strachey in Maine in 1607, John Smith in Virginia at about the same time, and more early eyewitnesses to this tended, curated landscape. Ceremonial stone landscape researcher Tim McSweeney builds on our updated knowledge and suggests the agricultural fires of the indigenous might have been controlled using stone-built fire breaks, stone rows, potentially serpent effigy rows. Known best for his blog, Waking Up on Turtle Island, McSweeney envisions an extensive amount of indigenous stonework on the landscape, thousands of years of work, and hundreds of thousands of miles of stone rows, much of which is now mistaken for later settlers' work. Thanks to the dig at the Flag Swamp Rock Shelter in Marlborough, Massachusetts, we know indigenous in what's now New England have been building with stone for over 4,000 years. Constructing stone rows to keep flames in check seems a logical development in controlling their surroundings. With the arrival of Europeans, indigenous landscape curation practices were brought to an end in the Northeast. Through over a century of exploration and trade post-Columbus, European sicknesses killed many indigenous people who had little to no immunity built up against them. One particularly virulent disease wiped out about 90% of indigenous populations along the northeast coast in the decade just prior to the Pilgrims' arrival. Some tribes still call this the Great Dying. King James of England called it a wonderful plague. The Puritans saw it as a blessing. "The Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess," Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts wrote in 1633. Early settlers weren't taming the land so much as taking over mostly emptied villages and abandoned planting fields. Though to be fair, some of these places had to be cleared of corpses. Marlborough, Massachusetts tells such stories on the city's website. Indigenous survivors were said to have called it Whipsapennicky, place of great or sudden death or dying. The extent of actual abandonment was likely exaggerated and may have been helped along, as it were. Early settlers' accounts often include indigenous survivors. Still, as the evidence provided by Mann, Cronin, and others shows, the careful curation of the landscape came to an end. Invasive and native species began to run amok, their growth freed from constraints by the disappearance of their indigenous caretakers. This was like a garden gone to seed. The forest that later settlers thought was primeval and enduring was actually in the midst of violent change and demographic collapse, according to Mann. While these new forests were growing, so were the tensions between indigenous tribes and newcomers. Opposing tribes would sometimes ally with opposing settlers' groups. Continental politics dictated the rifts between the Europeans. Power dynamics between indigenous groups appeared fluid in light of their sudden population changes. Wars began to break out with the attempted genocide of the Pequot Nation in the 1630s. But have you ever noticed that Yankee Lore skips right from the Pilgrims' landing to the American Revolution? The Pilgrims land, and then John Adams is in court because of the Boston Massacre. 150 years goes just like that. It's like skipping from the American Revolution to the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s. That's a lot of time. A lot of history happened. A lot of wars were fought between European settlers and indigenous people, some of which I've talked about in other videos, like the one on Redemption Rock and King Philip's War. So much went on throughout those 150 years that I can't cover it all here, but it deserves your future attention, because this time jump allows Yankee Lore to pretend indigenous people just went away. Those who did go didn't go willingly, and many stayed. They are still here, despite Yankee Lore's timey-wimey magic eraser. The 4,000-year-old legacy of indigenous stone building in New England should lead us to be wary of erasing potential indigenous contributions to the stonework found across our New England landscape, though Yankee Lore claims otherwise. We don't really have a lot of objective historical evidence as to who built the extensive stone walls and stonework of the Northeast. We do have a lot of people who just know they were built by sheep farmers. No, wait, who just know they were built by early settlers. No, I'm sorry, who just know they were built once all the wood was used up for fuel. You get the idea. These don't agree with each other, but they all agree with Yankee Lore. And all are employed by those who still insist that Indians around here never built with stone. That's some strong Yankee Lore. On the other hand, amateur researchers in New England have been looking into potential indigenous stonework since the mid-1970s. James Maver and Byron Dix released their findings in 1989 in Manitou, the sacred landscape of New England's native civilization. Many have followed up on their insights. Recent scholarship includes Lucienne Lavin and Elaine Thomas's Our Hidden Landscapes, Indigenous Stone Ceremonial Sites in Eastern North America, gathering professional, indigenous, and avocational voices together on the subject. This is a serious field of research, yet new enough that it still met with some resistance. Because carbon-14 dating can't be used on non-organic material, researchers have turned to optically stimulated luminescence dating, OSL dating, used around the world to date stonework, with a method based on the mineral's exposure to sunlight. Some early pre-contact and pre-settlement dates have come back for some of the stonework tested in this area. But many official and academic archaeologists in New England don't accept these dates and openly question the efficacy of OSL testing in New England soil. They don't like the dates and won't embrace the technology. Of course, no dating provided, C14 or OSL, has been accepted as of yet. The assumption all the stonework is colonial or later dominates New England's archaeological community, as it's tended to since the late 1970s, when they circled their proverbial wagons to oppose those like Barry Fell, who suggested pre-Columbian Europeans were exploring and building stonework here. Now with the suggestion some of this could be indigenous stonework, they just know Indians around here didn't build with stone. It's disappointing when scientists fall back on Yankee Lore. It gives it a scientistic shine, but it's not science. It's scientism, which even rejects resolutions passed by United South and Eastern Tribes, USET, a coalition of federally recognized indigenous tribes, identifying indigenous ceremonial stone landscapes in the Northeast and asking for help in protecting them. Former president of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and former editor of its bulletin, Dr. Curtis Hoffman, faulted colleagues for this scientism in his notable 2018 study, Stone Prayers, Native American Stone Constructions of the Eastern Seaboard. As an independent researcher and journalist investigating possible indigenous ceremonial stone landscapes, I've found myself unlearning a lot of Yankee Lore. Sharing my fascination with our ancient stone mysteries and the potential we could be seeing stone prayers and effigies leads me to stonework sites around New England, where I often see what appears to be ancient indigenous stonework, as I detail in my video presentations. I find we are likely now looking at a blended landscape, where at least 4,000 possible years of indigenous stonework lies beneath 400 years of European stonework, some of which adapted and used the work which came before it. This blended landscape comes into sharper focus once we learn to see through and past the veils of Yankee Lore. I'm Mike Luoma. Thanks for watching.